I'm Molly Thomas, guest hosting Context this week for Lorna Duick. Today, Ebola, finding hope in the midst of an epidemic. A doctor in the trenches offers a new perspective on the crisis.
A generation ago, it was merely a river in Central Africa. Today, the name Ebola evokes powerful images of misery and grief.
This is an emergency, and we are already in trouble.
At the heart of the battle are thousands of extraordinary people. Coming up, a feature interview with Franklin Graham of Samaritan's Purse.
And I knew it was a death sentence.
He shares rare details about Dr. Kent Brantley's personal story of surviving Ebola. And up first, an eyewitness account from a Canadian doctor who recently returned from the front lines.
West Africa is facing the largest outbreak of Ebola since the disease was first found 4 decades ago. Now, the disease has killed thousands, leaving children without parents and parents without children. Villages in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone have all been terrorized by this disease, and now Ebola has made its way to North America and Europe as well. Let's turn things over to Sheldon Neal with some fast facts on the topic. Sheldon.
Thank you, Molly. Researchers have traced the origins of this outbreak to a small village in southern Guinea near the Liberia-Sierra Leone border. Over 4,000 people have died because of the virus since March 2014. As many as 1.4 million people in West Africa could be infected with Ebola by January 2015, according to the U.S. Center for Disease Control. For every person contracting the disease in Liberia, an additional 3 or 4 are becoming infected. Symptoms include high fever, headache, nausea, and massive bleeding. By current estimates, there are 350 to 400 beds at Ebola treatment centers in Liberia for an estimated need of, get this, 2,000. Ebola victims are being turned away from overcrowded treatment centers, and at present, the small handful of organizations responding to the crisis are seriously under-resourced.
Our first guest has fresh perspective from Ebola hot zones. Dr. Tim Jagatic is a tropical disease specialist who has made multiple trips to West Africa this year. Now, Dr. Jagatic joins us from Windsor, Ontario, after recently treating patients in Sierra Leone. Now, thanks for joining us, Dr. Jagatic.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Doctor, Ebola is not a new disease. So why is the outbreak so bad right now?
Well, yeah, the first time that it broke out was in 1976, and since then there's been over 20 outbreaks, but they've all occurred in small, remote villages with very little mobility coming in and out of these villages. But this outbreak was different because this is the first time that we had an outbreak in a large urban environment, which is very densely populated and lots of mobility in and out of the city. And so when we saw that, we realized that we had a lot of factors which were giving the disease the ability to really propagate and kind of go out of control.
You know, I want to know, kind of go back to the basics. How exactly is Ebola transmitted?
Right. So Ebola is transmitted simply by close contact with infected bodily fluids. It's not an airborne disease. And so when we were seeing people getting infected in this particular part of the world, it was happening because what happens in this particular part of the world is that during funeral rituals, we have very close contact with the body. And when somebody dies of Ebola, what their body does is it starts secreting a lot of fluid. And this fluid is full of Ebola. So when we have close contact of people coming to a funeral where a person has died of Ebola, and they are kissing this body, hugging it, touching it, and then wiping away tears or wiping their nose or just simply touching their mouths afterwards, they're essentially putting the virus right into their bodies. And we're seeing, you know, up to 100 people show up to these funerals. So what we have is we have this one little source of the virus, and they are people just coming there one by one, inoculating themselves with it.
What are the initial symptoms? I mean, they're very flu-like, so how would you know the difference?
Yeah, so like you said, that these are very nonspecific. We have headache, fever, nausea, vomiting, but the most important thing for us to do is to take the history of the patient. So that's very important because we need to know if this patient has had contact with somebody who has been sick with Ebola or with Ebola-like symptoms, or have they been to a funeral. These are the things that we ask when we're on the ground, and these questions are very helpful in helping us determine whether or not this patient has to come into our treatment centers.
Now, Dr. Gadek, you've been to all 3 countries where that outbreak is imminent there. Was there a difference between these areas of infection?
Well, there was, because the first time I was in Conakry, which is a major urban area, and relatively speaking, it had infrastructure. So this infrastructure was in the ways of roads, so we had easy ways of transport. Lots of people had cellular telephones, a lot of people had access to radio and television. So we were able to send out the message of what Ebola was to these people relatively easily. We were able to put out public service announcements on television and radio. We were able to have people contacting their family members on their cell phones to see if they are in contact with anybody or if they've been in situations where they might have been in some type of exposure-related incident. But when I was in Kailahun, which is in Sierra Leone, that was essentially out in the middle of nowhere. And there was no infrastructure, and I mean nothing. We didn't have electricity, we didn't have roads. It was during the rainy season, so these roads, which were just muddy pathways, we were seeing difficulty in actually accessing a lot of these villages. What should have been normally a 20-minute drive turned into a 3-hour drive.
I think about the time when I was a journalist in East Africa, when you were in the rural areas, anytime there was Medicare of any sort, people would come in clumps. There'd be the community would all come out. I mean, how do you decide who gets treated when there's basically everyone that lives there?
Yeah, that's a very difficult thing. When we weren't swamped as we are right now, the way that we were doing it was having everybody come in, and we would do our history, and the ones who had a high suspicion of Ebola, we would have them come into our facility, and then we would begin the treatment process. And we would then take their blood to see whether or not they would be positive or negative, and then they would come in and we would continue the treatment. But now, in the situation that we're in, we are our resources are stretched so thin, we're completely understaffed, and when we're turning away people, we're turning away the people who are early in the disease. We're currently just providing palliative care right now in many of our centers, which means that we're taking in the people who are on the verge of dying. And the reason that we're doing this is because when we have the body afterwards, we're able to prevent that body from being exposed to hundreds more people through the funeral practices. And so we're able to put safe burial practices into place. So it's very difficult for us in the situation that we're in right now. But that's what we're seeing. So palliative care patients are getting the priority right now.
Now, amidst this, sadness, there is hope, though. There is no drug cure, but you say there is a human cure.
That's right. When people speak about there not being a treatment, that's not necessarily true. It's very important for us to specify that there is no drug cure. But what we do is when we provide our supportive therapy to the people, when we give them fluids, when we give them Tylenol for their fever, when we give them proper nutrition, we're giving these people the ability to create their own antibodies against this disease. And when they create the antibody response against the disease, we're seeing that they're able to cure themselves of the disease. So they are curing themselves. It is a cure, the antibodies. And going back to the original point of how we're turning into a palliative care center, it's really turning into an ethical debate as to what we're doing out there. Because we know we can provide a treatment that works to these people, but we're not because we don't have the resources to do it. And it's very troubling when we know that people can leave this hospital, leave our treatment facilities completely cured, but we don't have the capacity to do this. So we're turning away people who can be cured, and that is very troubling.
Doctor, I have to ask you, what inspires you to do what you do? There has to be an element of fear within yourself as well.
Well, there is always in the back of the mind that we understand the risk that we're taking. There is, even though we're trying to eliminate the risk as much as we can, there is a little bit of risk. But with MSF, I'm very confident with the measures that we have in place in terms of our infection control. This is the world's leading organization in terms of dealing with Ebola outbreaks. So being on the team, which is essentially the best of the best, that's very comforting. And in regards to why I do it, it's every human on Earth has a right to health. And we are trying to eliminate those barriers for these people because they have the right to be healthy. And when we go out there, that's what we're trying to do.
All right, I think we're going to open it up for some questions from the audience.
Doctor, with all the fear and inaccurate information out there, you obviously can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, but what is a best case scenario?
Best case scenario is that we're able to finally just contain this outbreak. The measures that we currently have in place, we are confident that these are the only measures that need to be taken in order to prevent this outbreak, but we need more people doing it. So what we have is something that's effective, but it's not effective right now because it's not in the proper numbers. What we do is we go out into the community, we provide education about how this thing is being transmitted. And when people understand this, we've been seeing it's very effective in them changing their behavior patterns. So if we can get more people on the ground, going out there into the outreach programs, having more treatment facilities available for those who are infected, distributing soap, distributing chlorine, distributing masks and gloves, these types of things, then we can see this coming to an end much quicker than originally anticipated.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Recently, the government of Sierra Leone had everybody go indoors for 3 days. And while they did a door-to-door assessment in communities, did that help? And would doing something like that again help?
See, these types of measures are, logically speaking, maybe in a black and white scenario, they sound good, they look good on paper. But what you're doing when you do this is that you run the risk of creating a sense of mistrust. And when people feel that they're being forced into a situation, we don't know what the outcome is, because when people are forced to go indoors, are they now forced to spend 3 days with somebody who is Ebola positive? When people have 3 days later when they come out, do they say, there's no way I'm ever going to go to a hospital if this is how they treat us? So there's a lot of unanswered questions about this, and it's really kind of worrisome about these types of measures. What we try to do is we try to establish a sense of trust among the people. Let them know that this is all voluntary to come in. If I can give a quick anecdote, when I was in Conakry, we had one patient whose family refused to have her come to the clinic, and she was very clearly Ebola positive. She had contact with multiple Ebola positive patients, and she was exhibiting symptoms. But at the end of the day, we did not take her. We said, this is your decision, but here are the recommended guidelines to follow in order to prevent the transmission. 2 days later, she showed up voluntarily. So what might not seem logical is it's difficult to persuade people that it might be the more effective way to go, because we have to take into the element the emotional considerations as well. When somebody says that they're glad that they weren't forced to come somewhere and then they were able to do it voluntarily, then it looks like we're getting better cooperation and better outcomes. So really, at the end of the day, what we're looking for is cooperation and trust. And it's very important for us to establish that as the basis as we're moving forward with these outbreaks.
All right, Dr. Jagatic, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for everything you do, and good luck the next time you go out.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
It's Dr. Tim Jagatic, a tropical disease specialist with Doctors Without Borders. Imagine contracting a disease you were sent to treat, hoping it's malaria, but finding out it's Ebola. That's the story of one U.S. doctor. We dig deeper into the details around Dr. Kent Brantley next. Recently sat down with Franklin Graham, the son of evangelist Billy Graham. Now they discussed Dr. Kent Brantley, the Samaritan purse doctor who contracted and survived Ebola. Now it's time to put his story into context.
Tell us what began to hit your desk when you realized you have workers that have been infected with Ebola. The Kent Brantley story.
I think it was probably the most difficult week of my life. I was in Alaska when one of my men called me and said, Franklin, Kent Brantley has Ebola. And I knew it was a death sentence. And I left Alaska, went back to North Carolina, and we had an insurance policy that part of that policy would be if you had someone overseas and they had to be evacuated by ambulance, that this aircraft would come and get you. Okay, so we called the company up, and we told them we have an Ebola patient. They just laughed at us. We don't carry Ebola patients. And we had absolutely zero hope of getting Dr. Brantley back to the United States until we talked to a person at the U.S. State Department, and he rented the plane. CDC, again, supported it. Emory University agreed to take him. But the problem was that time was ticking. It was the 7th day of his infection before the plane could leave. And then it had to turn around and come back because it had a malfunction. It took 19 hours to fix the malfunction. The clock is ticking. And the 9th day of his infection, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, in North Carolina, we had a call, Liberia. We called every day at 3 o'clock. Dr. Brantley's not going to make it. And our hearts just sank. And I just went back and I sat in my office. I thought, Lord, we've done everything we can do. And I just got on the floor and prayed. And all throughout our office and in Liberia and family members, all at that hour, all convened in prayer. The day before, a medicine, a serum, had showed up, made from mice blood, grown on tobacco leaves, and then extracted. This serum, it produces antibodies, but it sounds almost spooky. And looking at it was spooky because in Liberia it comes frozen to like 200 degrees below zero. And you open up this thing and the vapor and the steam coming, it looks like something out of a science fiction movie. And it was kind of mysterious how it just showed up. We weren't expecting it, it just showed up.
Was it your call to say, we'll try it?
I was part of the decision. I believe in always letting your people on the field make the final decision. But when I was told it was made from mice blood and had something to do with tobacco leaves, I had my doubts, to be honest with you. But at 3 o'clock, we were told he was dying. And Dr. Brantley had already said to give it to Nancy Wright-Bolt. But our doctor there made the decision, no, we're going to give the first packet to him because Dr. Brantley was within hours of death. Nancy was still a little bit better shape at that point. But this serum had to be thawed out. And Nancy Wright-Bolt had actually had it under her arm trying to thaw it out when they came in and took it to give it to Dr. Brantley. And when they put it in Dr. Brantley's arm, he went within seconds into immediate convulsions and shaking violently. And after about 30 minutes, his breathing, which was up to that point had been very labored, he felt that he was going to die of respiratory failure because he couldn't breathe. And he didn't have any reserves, he didn't have any strength. And after about 30 minutes, his breathing began to relax and become at a normal rate. And within about 45 minutes, Dr. Brantley gave a thumbs up. It had a dramatic, instant effect on him.
You still have 500 workers in Liberia. It is still a red-hot Ebola zone. What makes people take that kind of risk?
You don't have a choice. Always.
Explain that.
It's just like with Dr. Brantley. He wasn't there to fight Ebola. He was there as a family practitioner working in Elwa Hospital. Samaritan's Purse had...
you could pull everybody out. You could shut it down.
A number of programs all over, Africa, Liberia. And all of a sudden Ebola comes to us. We weren't searching for Ebola. But the Lord Jesus Christ, think of the man with leprosy. When Jesus finished speaking on the Mount of Olives, and he was coming down the mount, a leper, there was no hope for leprosy. There was no cure for leprosy. If a leper approached, he had to warn people, I'm a leper, to give people a chance to run. And here he comes to Jesus, and he asks Jesus to heal him. And Jesus reaches out his hand, and he touches the leper. He doesn't run.
Is that your motivation in saying, Samaritan's Purse, we will keep facing countries that have Ebola or could have even worse? Fear, faith, when is it safe?
Where's safe? I mean, are we safe here? I don't know. People die every day. And the death rate is 100% for all of us. We're all going to one day have to cross the river of death. And what's going to wait for us on the other side?
What makes you so sure that you understand God's plan for our lives and for what's next?
I don't know if I understand God's plan for everybody's life. I only know what his plan is for my life. And he wants to use Franklin Graham to try to touch as many people's lives as he can for not my glory, but for his glory. I know that I'm a sinner, and I know that our sins separate us from God. Franklin Graham is a sinner. I was 22 years old when I got on my knees one night and I said, God, I've sinned, forgive me. I believe that Jesus Christ died for me, and I would like to invite him to come into my heart and to reign in my heart, and I want to follow him as my Savior from this day forward. And I prayed that prayer, and I meant it. And I know that night God forgave me, and he'll forgive anybody who's willing to pray that prayer, that same prayer. He will forgive their sins and heal their hearts. And not only will he heal your hearts, but he'll open up a plan. He's got a plan for our lives.
And that might be being in an Ebola zone. That might be being in an incredibly dangerous decision to take mice blood experimental serum. You believe that?
Well, you know, when you come down to the last minutes of life, if you have an opportunity to throw a lifeline, do you throw the lifeline? Or do you think, well, I wonder what the lawyers will think? You know, maybe that lifeline's not big enough, and maybe the person will get tangled up, and maybe they'll choke themselves, or whatever, all these what ifs, and lawyers are good at the what ifs. And we just made the decision. He's dying. He'll be dead before midnight. What are we going to do? And we had a lifeline to throw, and it was called ZMAP. And ZMAP, and I don't know, and the doctors at Emory don't know if it was ZMAP. I don't know if it was ZMAP, if it was the prayers of hundreds of people around the world praying at the same time for him. But here's what one of the nurses said. It's like God showed up, and it was.
Franklin Graham, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, Sheldon, over to you with a question for our audience at home.
Thank you so much, Molly. Our question for you is this. How do you think the international community should respond to the Ebola outbreak? Send us your answers by any of the means you see there on the screen. Context is two-way television. When you talk, we certainly listen.
Let's turn it over to our studio audience now. Is there anything that surprised anyone or anything that comes to mind?
This whole Ebola thing is so massive. The mortality rate or the incidence is just continues to climb. In Sierra Leone in early August it was about 10 new cases a day. Early September it was 30 to 40. Now it's getting close to 100 a day. And so, and I went to the Canadian government and asked, if I somehow, they would help me get in. And I'm really disappointed that I hear a lot about ISIS and all these things, but I don't hear very much about how Sierra Leone and the other two countries in that area can be helped. So I really like to see the Canadian government get a little more excited about it and get support, and we need a lot of money is also what's needed there too.
Yeah, there's a lot of international issues right now, so it's,
Yeah.
you know, pick and choose, I guess, sometimes. Thank you for your comments. Appreciate it. Coming up, some final thoughts on taking risks in a dangerous world. The word Ebola strikes a powerful chord across the globe. Now, it's both a reminder of human frailty and a testament to the power of humanity. Now, this is not an African issue, it's a human one. Amidst the tragedy and anguish, there's a certainty that we are all connected. Now, this human element requires us, it should really drive us to rally together. The odd paradox about tragedy is that it has the power to unleash worldwide compassion. Think about the response to Ebola, the Haitian earthquake, or the South Asian tsunami. And we've heard incredible stories today about medical professionals risking their own lives for the sake of strangers. Isn't this what the gospel commands us to do? Even Dr. Kent Brantley, an Ebola survivor, said, "We cannot sit back and say, oh, those poor people. We must rather think outside the box and find ways to help." For Lorna Duick and the entire Context team, I'm Molly Thomas. Thanks for watching. Join Lorna next week as we explore life beyond the headlines.